Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I saw this article a few days ago from Reuters saying that the U.S. Appeals Court rejects challenge by 4 states to state and local tax cap, or SALT taxes for short. Now, what the SALT tax deduction is this really nifty little deduction on your income taxes for your federal income returns that allow you to deduct any state and local taxes, like property taxes, sales taxes, those sorts of things. It allows you to deduct those from your federal income taxes. And as the article summarizes, a federal appeals court on Tuesday rejected efforts by 4 Democratic-leaning U.S. states to overturn former Republican President Donald Trump's decision to limit federal deductions on state and local taxes, because this is from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, I'll get into this court decision in just a second. It was a 3-0 decision, explain the rationale, but it can also help us to understand the implications of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, say that 3 times fast, and that's had and will probably continue to have, and also the pressures that the current administration might have to reverse that or change course with the SALT deduction specifically. Now, as for a little history, the SALT deduction is actually a very old idea by American standards. Back in 1861, 1862, around that time, the income tax was sort of given its experimental form. There wasn't an income tax throughout the United States up until that point. This was during the Civil War, so a lot of different sorts of things were tried out during that time. But the Tariff Act of 1862, signed by President Lincoln, allowed the government to start collecting a very rudimentary form of income tax, but it also included a provision for a state and local tax deduction, which would eventually go on to become the SALT deduction. But this income tax was very short-lived because the Constitution didn't really allow for it. What actually happened after this act was passed, after the Civil War was over, eventually it fell out of favor and the income tax was effectively removed. But towards the end of the century, it was reinstituted in a new form and was actually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. So the income tax was officially forbidden, at least at a federal level, and that's because the court said that the federal government of the United States did not have the power to issue a federal income tax. But of course, that didn't stop our friends at the federal government, because you might ask, how on earth do we have a federal income tax today? And that's because in 1913, an amendment to the United States Constitution was passed. After all, if something is unconstitutional, you could always just change the Constitution if you can get enough support for it, of course. And there was enough support from the states and Congress to actually put together an amendment to allow for an income tax specifically at the federal level. Thereafter, the United States has had a federal income tax up until the present day, and pretty much throughout that entire time has had a state and local tax deduction. And it has shifted in a number of ways throughout that time, but generally it was pretty heavily leaning towards favoring states and allowing them to have pretty substantial deductions against federal income, or not really the states themselves, but the actual state taxpayer will get a deduction based on their actual state taxes against their federal taxes. So if you're paying a lot of state taxes, you'd get a deduction on your federal taxes. And the rationale for allowing that state and local tax deduction to remain was because it was a sort of federalist value. And by federalist, I mean federalism, in that you have a state and federal sort of level of government, and you want to make sure that the federal government doesn't sort of completely overshadow everything that a state is supposed to do. There are separate roles between both parts of the government. And by allowing the SALT deduction, you'd allow states to still have plenty of income and allow them to do their sort of operations without impeding too much on the federal government's ability to tax citizens in different ways. So that was kind of the idea and the rationale. It was a sort of separation of powers sort of argument. But then in 2017, we saw the SALT deduction limited in its scope in a pretty significant way, but we'll get to that in just a second. Right now, I want to actually dive into the court case. And before we go any further, do note that this is not a Supreme Court case. This is a Second Circuit case, which is one of the highest courts in the land before you get to the Supreme Court in the US. The country is generally divided into a number of these circuit courts, and they kind of are the last sort of line of defense, I suppose, before you get into the Supreme Court. Now, there are 13 federal circuits, so technically this Second Circuit ruling would only apply to the Second Circuit, and the remaining 12 could all have their own rulings, but typically they kind of try to follow each other. And in any event, if this gets appealed up to the Supreme Court and they take it, that would apply to everyone else anyway. So it's definitely worth looking at, and I think it's helpful for the discussion around SALT deductions in general. Anyways, let's get into the case. Notice that this was argued way back in December of 2020, and we finally got our ruling just a few days ago on October 5th. And this was specifically with plaintiffs being the state of New York, state of Connecticut, state of Maryland, and state of New Jersey, all relatively high tax states when we're talking about the whole landscape of the US. But we'll get into it in just a second. Moving on into the decision, they start off with a brief history talking about about, in 2017, Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which imposed a $10,000 cap on the SALT deduction. The immediate impact of the new cap was felt most acutely in states where the state and local tax liability of residents often exceeds the $10,000 maximum. 4 of the states most affected, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Maryland, the plaintiffs here sued the federal governments. That's the basis of this case. They're saying, hey, this law impacted us unfairly. That's the main argument that they will make. But moving forward, we get into, through the background, they explain some of the actual history that kind of just explained about where the income tax came from, where the SALT deduction came from, and how it really isn't a new thing. And that's one of the main arguments plaintiffs are making, that this is kind of ingrained into the system and really should be a constitutional standard that we keep. That's their main argument. Anyways, the SALT deduction nevertheless remained durable until 2017. Eligible taxpayers could, subject to the standard deduction and some other things, always elect to deduct all state and local real and personal property taxes, as well as either all state and local income taxes or all state and local sales taxes. In general, states had a pretty wide deduction room for this SALT deduction. So if I was paying a lot of taxes in Illinois, if I had a bunch of property taxes, high sales taxes, we don't have too high of income taxes yet, but we'll see. That could be coming very soon. If that were to happen and I was paying more than $10,000 in state taxes, then I could deduct that against my federal income taxes without really any limit. The rationale behind the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I don't know how many more times I have to say that, but geez, it is a mouthful. Anyways, they said that the congressional and executive branch proponents of the new cap on the SALT deduction openly proclaimed that it would adversely impact states with higher overall state and local taxes, significantly more than other states, which makes sense because that really is true. According to then Speaker of the House Paul Ryan and his widow speak, the SALT deduction had created a disparity in which the people in states that have balanced budgets, whose state governments have done their job and kept their books balanced and don't have massive pension liabilities, they're effectively paying for states that don't. And I find it hard to argue against that. Basically, what the SALT deduction did is it was a sort of subsidy for those states that had high taxes, at least for those taxpayers in high tax states. So since, for example, going back to Illinois, if I'm paying a bunch of property taxes in Cook County specifically, formerly I'd be able to write all of those off against my federal income taxes. So it's as though I just have to pay less to the federal government and I'm still receiving the same amount of federal benefits in return, theoretically speaking. So what that means is that any state that has really high taxes is sort of getting a subsidy from those states that have lower taxes, if we're just looking at it at a very simple kind of high-level view. And obviously, the proponents of this SALT deduction cap definitely didn't like that, and they wanted to limit that and punish those states that had higher taxes and were allowing their people to take advantage of the pretty sweet deduction. And although it's difficult to measure the exact impact that the SALT deduction cap has had and will continue to have, I think without a doubt, this is probably the single greatest factor that has contributed towards the mass movement of a lot of higher earners and a lot of people with a lot of wealth from higher tax states into lower tax states, comparatively lower tax states, in the past couple of years. Sure, you could make a lot of arguments that the reason lots of people are leaving California, for example, or leaving Illinois, or leaving New York. I think you could make an argument that some of the lockdown restrictions and those sorts of things kind of around freedom could have been a big reason why people were moving. Weather is obviously always a factor, though California has plenty of fantastic weather, so wouldn't really apply as much there. You could say that some of those measures were bigger influences, and sure, for some people they might have been, but taxes are really fundamental. But when it comes to taxes, as soon as people's wallets are touched in a significant way, people get very angry very quickly and will find ways to either work around it or do something to get their money back. And if you're a really wealthy person living in a high tax state, all of a sudden you're paying all of these state taxes and don't get a write-off. It's as though your effective tax rate has gone up 10, 20, 30%, however big you want to make it, depending on how much money and taxes you are paying. That's probably not going to sit well with many different people, and I think it's no surprise that we're seeing the amount of migration between sort of high and low tax states that we've seen over the last couple of years. I'm sure a lot of it has been accelerated by the pandemic and the other issues associated with that, and the new work from home movement that has really been given new life in this otherwise pretty rough time. I definitely don't think this issue should be overlooked, at least when we're talking about higher wealth individuals, higher income individuals who have high taxes to pay. After all, money goes where it is treated best. Let's get into the case decision itself, since I think it outlines some interesting constitutional issues. I won't go too in depth into this, but I think it's helpful knowledge for anyone living in the US or anyone who's interested in this sort of thing. Anyways, the plaintiff states commenced this action to enjoin the government from enforcing the SALT deduction cap. They wanted to stop the government from using it, essentially, claiming that it violates the 16th Amendment. They argued that any federal income tax must permit a deduction for all or a significant portion of state and local taxes. They also claim that the SALT deduction cap violates both Article 1, Section 8 and the 10th Amendment because it coerces them to lower taxes or cut spending. This is the coercion argument that we'll get to in the second half of this, but let's keep going. According to them, the cap increases the effective cost of state and local property taxes, renders homeownership more expensive, depresses home equity values, and slows the real estate market in their respective states. I would tend to agree. It definitely does that. It's not going to help these states that have high taxes, and thus this deduction is gone. Now, the citizens of their state are footing that bill. That's removing money from the state economy. It's not going back into creating jobs and creating things like that. It's going back to the federal government, which will then help other states besides those high tax states. Now, a large portion of this opinion, which I'll include in the description below if you want to take a look at it for yourself, a large portion of it does look at kind of a standing issue and whether or not the states have suffered actual harm here, since that's a requirement to actually bring a case forward. In this case, they say, yes, they did suffer harm. They lost a lot of benefits because this deduction was capped. At least those higher tax states are going to have some negative effects, is what they're saying. So there's enough standing here to bring a case forward, is kind of what a large portion of this opinion says. But moving on beyond that, the SALT deduction cap, they say, effectively eliminates a constitutionally mandated deduction for taxpayers. So they're saying that the Constitution effectively provides for a requirement to have a SALT deduction. Now, the court says that Congress's broad power to tax is limited only by restrictions expressed in or arising from the Constitution. Since the federal government can't just do anything at once, at least in theory, it has limitations set forth in the Constitution. And the Constitution articulates a lot of specific powers that the federal government has. And generally speaking, anything that's not the federal government's issue is for the states to work on and decide for themselves. And that's kind of our system of federalism, which I mentioned earlier. But to this issue, the court says that the plaintiffs have not demonstrated how the 2017 cap on the deduction unconstitutionally undermines their state's sovereign authority over fiscal matters or their ability to raise revenue. The plaintiff states fail to plausibly allege that their taxpayers' total federal tax burden is now so high that they cannot fund themselves. And while they argue that the SALT deduction lowers the effective costs of state and local taxes, they point us to nothing that compels the federal government to protect taxpayers from the true costs of paying their state and local taxes. So the court's really just saying that there isn't enough of a leg to stand on for these states to say that, hey, this is really going well beyond the scope of what the federal government can do. It's impeding the state's ability to do what they're supposed to do under the Constitution. And that wouldn't be okay if that was the case, but the court says that, hey, no, that is not actually the case. But I think the more interesting argument that the states make are that they alternatively assert that the SALT deduction cap coerces them to abandon their preferred fiscal policies in favor of lower taxes and reduced spending in violation of the 10th Amendment. We are not persuaded that the cap unconstitutionally infringes on state sovereignty, says the court. Now, in explaining the reason why they say this, Congress may use its taxing and spending authority to encourage a state to regulate in a particular way. But that pressure may not amount to compulsion because the Constitution simply does not give Congress the authority to require states to regulate directly or indirectly. Basically, the federal government can't take steps so egregious, I suppose, to where it actually coerces a state to do a particular action that would otherwise be a state power and not something the federal government is supposed to deal with. And the court is pulling this rule from NFIB versus Sebelius, which was the Obamacare case, or one of the Obamacare cases, that specifically looked at the issue of coercion. And the issue in that case, we actually studied this in law school, and I found it a very strange case relative to the many other constitutional cases we read, in that the whole issue was whether the federal government could remove Medicaid benefits from states who did not cooperate with Obamacare. So the stick rather than the carrot of the Obamacare Act was, if you sign up for Obamacare, you get to keep your Medicaid benefits. If you don't sign on to Obamacare as a state, you are going to lose all of your Medicaid benefits, which in the case of some states was like 10% of their budget. So it was a significant amount. And the Supreme Court said that the federal government couldn't do that. They couldn't coerce a state to do that because it basically had too much bargaining power, I suppose is really what it was getting down to. I found it to be very strange legal reasoning, but that is the precedent that we're working with now. A federal government can't take steps so large to coerce a state to do something that otherwise would be a state's prerogative. And in this case, the plaintiff states claim that their citizens face a comparably substantial harm. Their federal tax burdens will rise, the value of their homes will fall, and their jobs will disappear. Specifically, the plaintiff states allege that their taxpayers will pay hundreds of millions of dollars in additional federal taxes relative to what they would have paid had Congress enacted the 2017 Tax Act without the cap. We accept these allegations are true in that, yes, it definitely has the harm against the states, and there is, I guess you could say, some coercion, but the question is whether this coercion rises to the level of being so significant that it's actually unconstitutional. In this case, yet even then, we conclude that the plaintiff states have failed to plausibly argue that their injuries are significant enough to be coercive. So they say, yeah, it might be significant, but it's not significant enough to actually warrant us to come in and use this action. They later say that we do not mean to minimize the plaintiff state's losses or the impact of the cap on their respective economies, but we find it implausible that the amounts in question give rise to a constitutional violation. So they make a threshold argument that it just simply isn't big enough. They don't really challenge this actual precedent set by the Supreme Court. They're saying, yeah, they're not really in much of a position to, seeing as though they are below the Supreme Court, so they're supposed to follow what the Supreme Court says. And they're saying that even under this principle, it just wouldn't apply since the problem was not big enough. Now, furthermore, the plaintiff states try again to improve their claims by asserting that the SALT deduction cap violates the independent constitutional principle of equal sovereignty among the states. Congress knew, they say, that the cap's injuries would be unevenly distributed. And the court says, here, as explained, the SALT deduction cap has no effect on state sovereignty. The outsized effect of the SALT deduction cap on the plaintiff states arises only because the plaintiff states previously benefited most from the SALT deduction, not because the cap applies to some states but not others. They're saying that, yeah, sure, it affects you more adversely than others, but the law itself is the same for every state. And previously, you were benefiting more from it, so it's kind of weird to make the argument now. They're crying foul now that they're on the short end of the stick, whereas previously they were definitely getting the benefit of the SALT deduction arrangement. And lastly, the plaintiff states complain that Congress unfairly targeted them. Given our discussion of the statutory history, it is obviously true that members of Congress were aware that the SALT deduction cap would adversely affect some states more than others. But the SALT deduction cap is not unlike the countless federal laws whose benefits and burdens are unevenly distributed across the country and among the several states. As noted above, Congress may use its spending power to create incentives for states to act in accordance with federal policies, as long as pressure does not turn into compulsion. In summary, we agree with the district court that the SALT deduction cap is not coercive in violation of the 10th Amendment or the principle of equal sovereignty, and thus the Second Circuit ruled that the SALT deduction cap is constitutional under the United States Constitution. Now, what happens next to this case will be interesting, whether the Supreme Court takes it up or if there are similar cases in other circuits that maybe are ruled differently. That would be interesting and would probably prompt an actual Supreme Court review if there's conflicting precedent between the circuits, but time will tell whether that is the case. But in any event, I hope you guys found this informative. If you'd like this sort of legal-focused sort of analysis, definitely let me know. I am an attorney after all, so I am seeing stuff like this kind of all the time, and I'm definitely trying to stay up to date with it. So it'd be a nice excuse to do more content like this. If you liked it, definitely let me know in the comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. Otherwise, be sure to subscribe since I put out new videos every single week, mainly as they have to do with real estate investing and personal finance. But until next time, take care.